the inaugural installment of what will be an annual event, our Broad Seminar Series. I'm personally and we are collectively excited that our speaker today is Dan Goldhaber. I'll tell you a bit about Professor Goldhaber. Dan Goldhaber is the Vice President and Director of the Center for the Analysis of Longitudinal Data and Educational Research at the American Institutes for Research. He's also the Director of the Center for Education Data and Research at the University of Washington. Dan's work focuses on issues of educational productivity and reform at the K-12 level. The broad array of human capital policies that influence the composition, distribution, and quality of teachers in the workforce, and connections between students' K-12 experiences and post-secondary outcomes. Dan previously served as President of the Association for Education Finance and Policy. He's an elected member of the Alexandria School District Board and co-editor of the journal, Education, Finance, and Policy. This is an incredibly impressive list of achievements and accomplishments. I don't know if I should mention this one as an accomplishment exactly, but a key trait of Professor Goldhaber's is that he and I have known each other for a long time. long term. Way back, more than 30 years now.
I think it's an accomplishment.
Yeah. Way back when the notion of me wearing a tie on a perfectly fine Thursday would have been ridiculous. So I'm especially excited for my dear friends to be kicking us off here today. And I'm happy that our next installment of Broad Fellows, whom I'll be meeting over the next months, are here with us this afternoon as well. Dan.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here with you too. I want to tell you that Kerwin may not know this, but it's a little bit of a risk to invite me, or he may not remember. Because I think the last time that Kerwin saw me present anything was when we were both grad students at Cornell, and we had to give a mock job talk. And my mock job talk was a train wreck. I mean, it was terrible. And I actually had practiced quite a lot for it. But I was so practiced that I was like a little bit thrown off when I started to get questions. So I now no longer ever practice. I like to know a little bit about what I'm going to say, just a little bit. But my friends will say, Dan likes to be as surprised as the audience when the next slide comes up. And there's a little bit of truth to that. So I've had just a great couple of days at Yale and in New Haven, and it's been great to get to know some of you over the last couple of days, and I look forward to meeting some of you later today and tomorrow. But let me just sort of launch in and tell you that I'm going to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, the quality of the teacher workforce. But it was kind of a sexy topic 10, 15 years ago in the country in terms of policy and the nation's effort, but it's sort of, I think, fallen off of the policy agenda in many ways. And not because there's anything about the research that suggests that the quality of the teacher workforce is less important. If anything, I think the research over the last decade and a half reinforces the fact that we ought to be focused on the quality of the teacher workforce, but it's something that has been proven to be politically challenging to address. I'm going to go through the roadmap just very quickly of what I intend to present. But I also want to say that my hope is that this is kind of a dialogue. So this is not me up here, droning on for a half hour, 40 minutes, but there is some back and forth. So I really want to encourage folks to, raise their hand if they have thoughts or questions. The slides, are a little bit for me to make a few points, but mostly so that I remember to stay on track. So if there are things on the slides that you are not following, raise your hand, but also don't kind of worry about it too much, because again, the slides are kind of more for me than they are for you. So let me just sort of go through the roadmap. I'm going to begin by just kind of going through some stylized facts about teacher quality and its import and the fact that it is not equally distributed across, different subgroups of students. And just to be kind of blunt, I think that the way that the teacher labor market works is fundamentally screwed up, that we are not helping the students that are most in need of having high quality teachers. But I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm then going to run through the teacher pipeline. This is the best job that I could do to make a little pipeline. And I'm going to go backwards. So I'm going to start. This is a nifty tool, I got to say. Yeah. I'm going to go backwards, starting about how we think about teacher quality at the on the job stage when people are actually in the classroom and have classroom responsibilities, and then just kind of work back and say what I think we know about these other areas of drawing the right people into the teaching profession, doing screening, training, etc. And then, lastly, if there's time, and there may not be time, in fact, I kind of hope that there is not time because I hope that this is a dialogue. We'll have time for a few conclusions and questions and answers. Sound good? All right. All right, so let me begin by saying that I'm going to be using the term value added sometimes. And so let me say what value added is. Value added is a means that statisticians use to try to detect the impact that teachers have on students. So there are times when you certainly know a lot about the teacher workforce in terms of experience and credentials, et cetera, and sometimes those kinds of things might be correlated with their impact on students. But they certainly are not determinative of their impact. So you all have probably had teachers in your lives, or witness teachers, or hired teachers, where you're like, wow, Miss Jones, Mr. Ramirez, they are having incredible impacts on their students, and maybe it's even hard to understand what it is about what they are doing that is having an impact, but it's really affecting their students. So there are a couple of ways that statisticians measure this. They typically measure it by this statistical process where you're looking at students when they come into a class at the beginning of the year, where do they stand in terms of their test scores, and then at the end of the year when they're tested again, where do they stand at that point? There's a little bit more bells and whistles, but that's the basic idea. So it's the distance that students travel when they are with individual teachers. And so when you observe teachers across multiple classrooms, across multiple years, you can see that systematically there are teachers where there's typically more distance or less distance traveled. And that is a test-based measure of the teacher value added. More recently, there have been efforts to look at the other ways, the non-test ways that teachers influence students. And it turns out that just like there's variation in the workforce in terms of the test-based measures of teacher value added, there's also variation in the workforce in terms of the kind of impacts that teachers have on the likelihood that students show up for class, so their attendance rates, the likelihood that they go to take certain courses in the future or graduate from high school. So those are what I'm going to refer to as non-test value-added measures of teachers. All right, so are you with me on these value-added terms? All right. All right, and I'm a statistician, so I'm going to talk a little bit in standard deviation terms, but I'll try to give you a feel for what these things mean. What we see is that having a more effective teacher, and let's say that this is a teacher that is one standard deviation different from another. So if you were to, line teachers up from least effective teachers to most effective teachers, we're talking about a teacher that is in the middle of the distribution at the 50th percentile versus a teacher at the 84th or 85th percentile of the distribution, right? So a standard deviation difference is about that. That has an impact on student achievement that estimates vary, but is 0.13 to 0.25 standard deviations. Students typically learn from 1 year to another, anywhere from like a half to a full standard deviation. It varies as students progress through school. So teachers are important, but they don't explain all of what students learn, of course, like what's going on in the home, the culture of the school, peers. There are a lot of things that also matter. But there's one study that I'm thinking of that tries to kind of juxtapose the import of having a higher quality teacher versus reduced class size. And that study shows that the difference of 1 standard deviation change in teacher quality is approximately equivalent to a reduction of class size of about 11 students. So that's a big change in class size, right? So my read is that the evidence on test value added suggests that teachers and the quality of the teacher that you get is very important. And usually, when you talk to folks, that reflects their anecdotal impression too, because we all remember teachers that were really engaging and, helped us learn a great deal, and some that were, they were all right. I mentioned already that teachers don't just have impacts on test-based value added, but they have impacts on non-test outcomes like attendance. And it turns out that there's just about as much variation in the teacher workforce in the non-test impacts that teachers have as the test-based impacts that teachers have. And these things are correlated. So teachers that are good at, producing test gains tend to be some of the same teachers that encourage students to attend school and graduate. But the correlation is not super high between the two. So we could talk a little bit about what some of the implications are of that. And then something that's happened, it was actually about a decade ago, is that people have begun to connect, well, what's the relationship between having a higher, more or less effective quality teacher early in your life with later life outcomes. So there's a very famous paper by Raj Chetty and colleagues that looks at the relationship between teacher quality and the likelihood of high school graduation, the likelihood of going to college, and the likelihood of participating in the labor market and how much you earn in the labor market. And kind of the money line here is that if you were able to replace teachers that were at the very bottom of the value-added distribution, bottom 5%, and replace them with an average teacher, well, the estimate is that the present discounted value of earnings, lifetime earnings, is about $250,000 per classroom. So again, just all of this suggests that teacher quality is really, really important. All right, I want to purposely pause because I feel like I'm droning on a bit and just see if anyone has thoughts or questions.
Sorry.
Yeah.
How do you define teacher quality?
Well, so far I'm defining it by these statistical measures of what we can detect when we have big data sets and we're able to see teachers with lots of students. And so we could see that, having you as a teacher is really beneficial year after year after year, whereas having me, but I'm going to connect that to some more tangible measures of teacher quality like experience and licensure test performance, and talk about those relationships. Yeah?
Some systems, because of teacher shortages, have created what is labeled as alternative certification programs to increase the pipeline of teachers. In your studies or analysis, is it also considering like who is at that bottom 10% in like the ratio? Is it more alternative teachers? Is it more teachers who go on the traditional pathway of getting degrees on their own? How does that factor into the equation?
It varies a lot from state to state. Licensure is a state function. And so what is required of teachers in terms of their training and the kind of tests that they have to pass to get a traditional licensure or certification can vary across states, as does what is required of alternative paths into the profession. And so you raise an important issue because people often talk about this issue of alternative licensure, and sometimes there are, I think, kind of silly debates about, it's good or it's bad, as opposed to thinking a little bit about what are the nuances associated with what is required in the path. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but for now, let me talk a little bit more about it now, because I'll forget later. All right. There's been some good, bless you, there have been some good studies that look at teachers that come into the profession through alternative paths, like Teach for America. So there's a couple studies that I'm thinking of in particular where they randomize kids, right? So this is kind of the gold standard for how you can detect, separate out what is the effect of the teacher on the classroom from the composition of the classroom. Right? And that's really important because if we didn't do that, then the statistical methods would tend to show that the people that taught the honors classes were terrific, but that might not be about the teachers themselves. It might just be about the grouping of the students into the classroom. So the studies I'm thinking of where they do the randomization and then look at the test score growth of the students find that Teach for America, which is a well-known, alternative, that the Teach for America teachers are pretty effective, especially in math. And then in ELA, they're about as effective as teachers that are fully certified. Now, the downside is that they tend to leave the profession pretty quickly. So, I think that we want to be thinking about both what are the effects of the teachers and how long do they last, because there are costs associated with turnover. On the other hand, the state that has a very large alternative program, it's something like 70% of new teachers are coming into the profession in Texas without going through kind of a traditional certification program. There are some recent unpublished studies that suggest that the teachers that come in through the alt routes in Texas are not as effective as the teachers that come through traditional routes. So it varies. It varies. And I think that getting into the nuance of what's required in the traditional and alt route is important. Yeah.
In terms of the effect standard deviation, one, does that take into account the demographics of the teacher, both race, gender, as well as tenure? So do you find that teachers who've been in the profession for 20 years versus 3 to 5 years, is there an impact there? And are we talking about the same teacher with the same students over a period of time? Or are some of the teachers looping with students so that we see that the longer teacher A stays with the same set of students, that there's growth exponentially? Or is the teacher who are highly effective growing all kids regardless of the tenure or the duration that they have the students?
Yeah, I would never say all kids, because I think that the degree to which individual kids connect with their teacher is going to vary within a classroom. But a couple of great questions. So the looping, the answer is that I think the best evidence about looping suggests that it is not super common, but it is beneficial when it happens at the elementary school. You asked a question about race ethnicity. There is pretty good evidence, I think, that students, particularly African American male students, benefit from having some representation in the classroom. So there's a role model effect. It is helpful if you have a teacher that looks like you. It's not everything, right? So like it is all else equal beneficial, but oftentimes all else is not equal. So you want to consider the impact of the role model effect against, other things that you might know about the teacher. And then lastly, you asked a little bit about experience. And I'm going to actually talk about that in a second, but I will just say that there's lots of documentation that there tends to be returns to teacher experience early on, at least in a teacher's career, that they get better in the first 3, 5, 7 years pretty clearly, and then those returns level off after that. Yeah. All right, and actually that's a perfect segue. So okay, what do we have here? On the horizontal axis, I'm going to try to use this nifty tool here, we have teacher experience. So this is a study by Allison Atterbury and colleagues that I think is useful for illustrating the trade-offs between sort of using experience as a judgment about teachers versus value added. So as you move along the x-axis, we get teachers going from 0 years of experience up to 4, at least, with in terms of the study, and then on the vertical axis is the teacher value added, so the contribution they're making to student test scores in math and ELA. And what they do in this study is they group teachers into 5 quintiles, and they group them based on where they start. So this lowest line is the teachers that start out in year 1, their first year teaching, as having the lowest value added, second quintile, third quintile, fourth, and then top quintile. And it shows if you keep teachers grouped into these same categories, what does the value added for the group look like over time? So, does this setup make sense? All right, I'm seeing a few head shakes. Okay, so a couple things to point out. One, I'm going to stop with this. Generally, it is a cool tool, but I think it could be overused. Generally, there's an upward trajectory. All right, and this value added is normalized, so it's at 0. That doesn't mean people are, when you have teachers that are learning 0, it means that's the average. So it's all relative to the teachers in the workforce. So there tends to be an upward trajectory for most of the groups, except for the top group. So maybe there's some regression to the mean. But upward trajectory, and that upward trajectory represents the return to experience, right? That's teachers that are getting better on average as they gain more experience. But if you compare the groups, you can see that the averages don't cross. So by the time you get to year 4, the teachers that are the least effective at the beginning, they've caught up some, but they are still the least effective, right? And the categories don't cross at all. The other thing that I think is notable is that even though the top category, right, the most effective teachers at the beginning, that they don't look like they have the same kind of upward trajectory, but those teachers are more effective as novices, right? In year 0, right there, those teachers in year 0 are more effective at producing learning gains as novices than are any of these other categories in their 4th year. So as a statistician, if you were going to bet on which teacher, you knew just a couple things. You knew a teacher's experience level, and you knew where they stood relative to their peers in the first year. I think you'd be better off betting based on, where were they in their first year. So value added is going to be more predictive than teacher experience at determining, where someone's going to be later on in their career. So that, I think, is an important thing to know about the quality of the teacher workforce. All right. Yeah.
Do we know anything about the reasons why these teachers fell where they did in these quintiles? What were the differences between the fifth and first?
We do know a few things about that. There are things that predict where they're going to fall, not super well, but are predictive. So I'm going to actually talk about some of those. So if you don't feel like I've answered your question, in the next 15 minutes, let me know. All right. Teacher quality is, I've already said this, but teacher quality is unevenly distributed across schools and students. There's a study that I did a number of years ago that looked at measures of teacher quality. So now I'm moving away from value added as the sole measure. We're going to look at the experience of teachers. We've got some different measures of what it means to be inexperienced. You've got less than 2 years, less than 2 years of experience or less than 5 years of experience. We're going to look at the licensure test scores and whether or not you have a teacher that has a very low licensure test. I suspect most of you know this, but in I think every state but one, to become a teacher, to become eligible to teach in the workforce, you need to pass one or more licensure tests. Some of them are tests of basic skills. Some of them are tests of subject matter. And so we can look at the test score that teachers get and sort of group them into, different categories. And then value added. And by any of these measures, we find inequity in the distribution of teachers across students. I'm going to show you this just for teacher experience. All right. Here's the setup of this figure. The horizontal axis this is all Washington State. The horizontal axis is time. So the first data point we have is from 1985, I think, if I remember correctly. And we're going to look at the proportion of teachers that are novice with different subgroups of students. And what I'm going to show is the proportion that are novice teachers with underrepresented minority students, or URM. The figure looks very, very similar if instead of URM, we use a measure of poverty, whether students are receiving free and reduced price lunch. So I could have put a figure up that looked really almost exactly like this. And so here I'm going to say, what is the proportion of students that have a novice teacher? I'm going to start with non-underrepresented minority students, assuming that the students all have the average teacher in their district, right? Which is not a good assumption, or not necessarily a good assumption, but it's taking all the non-underrepresented minority students at the beginning, students, and saying, what if the kind of teachers that they have look like the average in the district? And we get a line that looks like this. The very steep drop-off that you see here is because of the Great Recession. So during the Great Recession, very few teachers were getting hired. So there's a big drop in the proportion of novice teachers. I think over the full time span, it's like 16% of the teachers have less than 5 years of teaching experience. So this is the figure for non-underrepresented minority students. And here is the line for underrepresented minority students. So it lies above the line for the non-underrepresented minority students, because if you are an underrepresented minority student, you're more likely to have an inexperienced teacher, right? And that gap is the gap that is due to quality. Let me go back. This is what we're calling the district level teacher quality gap. We can do the very same thing at the school level, right? We can say, imagine that you're a student and you have teachers that look like the average teacher in your average levels of experience of teachers in your school. We could actually do the very same thing at the classroom level, but it's a way of breaking apart how much of the gap that we see has to do with the distribution of teachers between and across districts versus within districts and within schools. Turns out that there is very little difference once you get to the school level. There's very little difference there's not much sorting, unequal sorting of teachers across students within schools. All right, so the sort of punchline is we can get the total gap, we can break it apart into the district and the school gap, and what we see is that going back 30 years, that there's inequity across students. I've shown you this for teacher experience. When you do the same thing for, getting teachers that, have very low licensure test scores or have low value added, you get the same sort of picture. The magnitudes differ, but there's inequity that exists across districts and schools. And this is true. This is Washington. The same thing shows up in North Carolina, Massachusetts. I can't remember what other states I have seen it in. So this is not a phenomenon that is unique. I think that this is a staple of the teacher labor market. And it is, I would argue, because we don't use compensation very strategically. And so one of the things that is driving this is that if you look at the schools that are serving high poverty or high minority student populations, that these are schools that they may be tougher. They may be tougher places to work in terms of the readiness of students and sort of are they at grade level. They may, some cases, have fewer resources. They may be in neighborhoods that are further away from where teachers want to live. We don't really know what all is it that makes schools super desirable or undesirable places to work. But what we do know is that there's systematically more junior teachers end up teaching in those schools. They teach there for a couple of years. Some people stay, lots of people stay, but people tend to move from the schools serving more needy students to the schools serving more affluent students that are doing better, on standardized tests and whatnot. And it is pretty rare. I'll come right back to you, Hansel. It's pretty rare to use pay to try to make those schools relatively more desirable. I suspect that many of you know this, but teachers tend to be paid according to a salary schedule. So that usually based on your years of experience and your degree level or the number of credits that you have, you can look at this matrix and say, oh, this is Miss Jones has, 6 years of experience. I'm going to go down the chart. And then she's got a master's degree. So I'm going to come over here. Boom. That is how much Miss Jones gets paid. We're not going to differentiate based on maybe the needs of the school system, that we need to hire lots of special education teachers, and there's a lot of people that are queuing up for a elementary education position, so it doesn't look like that's our real area of relative need. That subject area differentiation doesn't seem to happen very often, and it also is the case that if you're a school where you get relatively few applicants when you open up a position, that we don't see much evidence that those kinds of schools tend to offer more. Hansel.
I was going to ask, so everything you said in terms of possible explanation for this makes sense to me, but I'm curious sort of what you attribute the growth in the gap to be. why is it so much worse in 2015 than it was in, say, 2000?
I think that there are probably a couple of things that might be going on, and put this squarely in the bucket of Dan speculating as opposed to having a lot of great evidence. But I think that segregation is one of the things that predicts what's happening, and so over time there's been some greater segregation in the school system. There's a little bit of work that Jim Wyckoff at UVA has done on this, and I think that segregation is one of the best predictors of what's going on. In the paper that we did, segregation was one of the only community factors that seemed to be strongly correlated with this. Yeah.
On that point, it does seem like that. I know it's your speculation, but the fact that within school variation, the growth really seems to be coming from district to district, and so whereas like across schools in the same district, you're not seeing as much.
Yeah, though I do want to say this is the Washington picture. The picture in North Carolina looks different. And I think the picture in North Carolina looks different than Washington because the structure of school districts across the states is different. So even just the size of school districts might matter.
Going back to differentiated compensation, you mentioned that I guess either districts aren't doing it, or is it that districts who are trying it, because there are some states that are trying it, maybe the amount offered is not as great as it needs to be in order to make an impact?
This is another where I want to put your question on hold for 10 minutes, and then let me know if I don't get to it, because I think it's a very important question. Someone else had a hand up?
I was in a similar vein, so I'll park and lot it.
Okay. All right. Perfect. All right. We've only gone through the stylized facts of the teacher labor market. I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip talking about this in detail, just to say that when you try to sort of simulate what would happen if there wasn't so much sorting of teachers across different students, how much of the gaps in student achievement do we see explained? And the answer is, I think, a meaningful share, but certainly not all of them. Because what happens in schools is only kind of part of the equation, explaining why we see differences in student achievement. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about hopefully get to some of these questions. So I already said that I don't think that we use pay very strategically. And one of the ways that you might want to use pay is to try and address shortage areas, so sort of address some of the needs in the labor market. And you also might want to use pay to try to upgrade the skills of the teachers in the labor market, regardless of sort of their subject area. And when we think about upgrading the skills of the teacher workforce, I think that we have to think both about encouraging the individuals that are in the workforce to get better, maybe from effort or professional development, but also changing the composition of who's in the workforce. And so, it's actually kind of a complex picture when you think about the connection between compensation and evaluation and quality, that when states started to engage in the reforms under Race to the Top and the big push under Obama for teacher evaluation reform, I'm not sure that they had fully sort of thought through the mechanics of all the steps so that you could sort of see, here's the theory of action. Does it look like things are following along in the theory of action that you would hope? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. All right, so what do we know about influencing the quality of the people that are in the workforce? There's a lot of work on professional development and investments in professional development. I am sure that if there was someone different standing in front of you, they might have a different take on this. But my take is that when you look at the dollars spent on professional development, that the dollars don't really buy things that look like they're impacting teacher quality in ways that we can easily detect. Teachers will often say good things about the professional development, and it may be that professional development is having impacts on teacher quality that go undetected because, of course, we measure a lot of this based on student test scores. But the connection between investments in professional development and teacher quality and student achievement are, to my mind, pretty weak. It's not that it can't work, because there's evidence that when structured in particular ways, there's lots of, feedback and follow-up, and it's in-depth, et cetera, it looks, the evidence looks better, but it doesn't look like it works all that well writ large. Teacher evaluation and incentives. Big push, like I said, under Obama and Race to the Top, to redo teacher evaluation systems. And part of this came because there was a famous TNTP report called the widget effect, which said, hey, we can see statistically that there are these big differences between teachers, but the teacher evaluation systems say that they are all the same. So states invested billions and billions of dollars in changing the instruments that are used to, to assess teachers, the time, how frequently assessments take place, who does the assessment. Sometimes they added other elements to what was typically a classroom observation, like a value-added component, or they surveyed students and they used some of the student surveys and incorporated those into the teacher evaluation. So they did lots and lots of things. The best study that I know, this Bleiberg et al. Study, suggests that nationally we cannot see that these billions of dollars systematically improved the quality of the teacher workforce as detected by student outcomes. But things did work in some places. Actually, before I get to that, let me back up. Again, there are a couple of ways that the change in compensation and evaluation might affect. There's both the skills of the incumbents, and there's also the change in the composition. We know almost nothing about teacher dismissals. And oftentimes what you read in the media doesn't, I think, give a very complete picture of what's going on. So the place that I think was successful in terms of evaluation and compensation reform, or one of the places, is Washington, D.C. under Impact. When you read about Impact, you might read that there are lots and lots of teachers that are getting fired. I don't know what lots and lots are, 20, 30%. But that's from the stories that I would read. That, I think, might have been my takeaway as a layperson. I'm pretty sure that in the year where the most teachers were actually dismissed for poor performance, it was 2%. And that was the high year. So I don't think and I think this was a reform that was successful, not because 2% of the teachers were dismissed, but because if you look at student achievement in Washington, D.C., it is meaningfully better than it was before these reforms. So I don't think that you need to be thinking like, all right, we're going to end up dismissing, 20, 30% of teachers if we have evaluation reform. But you do need to probably to have some threat of dismissal and other kinds of incentives and the opportunity for really good teachers to earn a lot of money. In DC, if you're a really effective teacher over multiple years, you can earn well over $100,000. And you can get to that level quickly. We could talk a whole lot. We actually talked the other day a little bit about Impact in DC and sort of where it has gone. So maybe we can come back to that point. But we don't know much about dismissals. There's very recently, just in the last like a month or so, this paper that has come out by Nat Malkus and I can't remember who, Cummings, first name Cummings, about not dismissals, but people getting counseled out of the profession or counseled out of a school. Now I'm gonna use an anecdote here. Many years ago, Kerwin mentioned, I was on a school board in Alexandria. And there was a case where there was a high school teacher who was having an inappropriate relationship with one of the students. And there was no question that this was going on. There was emails, there was like a lot of documentation. And this is back in the 90s. So it's, pre No Child Left Behind. And what I would hear is, oh, yeah, not only is he doing this, but man, this guy's a really bad teacher. And so I asked the superintendent in a school board meeting, I said, like, well, how many teachers, don't get the top rating in the evaluation system, because they were all the teachers were evaluated every year. And he said, I'm not quite sure. Let me come back next meeting, tell you. And the answer next meeting was, well, everyone got top evaluation. So I said, well, Dr. Berg, how many teachers in the last 5 years have not received the top? I'll come back next meeting, tell you. 0. Everybody got a top rating over the 5-year period that I had asked about. But I would hear, well, that's not really how we do things here. We counsel people out, right? So what does that mean? It means that a principal goes to a teacher and says, hey, Joan, things aren't really working out this year. So I'm really encouraging you to get a different job so that, so that I don't have to give you a bad evaluation, right? And, Joan probably does go off and get a different job. But what happens is that you get a churn of people at the bottom of the distribution who don't leave the profession, but they just move from one school to another or one school system to another. And in some other work that I don't have time to talk about, we can see that statistically. So if you look at the value added of teachers and then you connect their value added to mobility, you can see there's a lot of mobility between different schools and districts, especially at the very bottom of the distribution. So in this study, it's the first one I've seen that tries to quantify how much counseling out is happening. They estimate that 20% of the teachers that leave are leaving because they're being counseled out. But that's 20%, if I remember, based on talking to principals at a couple of schools. So I think we don't really know much about systematically what's happening here. But just returning to my anecdotal story, there was no disagreement on our school board about whether this teacher should be fired from Alexandria City Public Schools. It was a 9-0, we're going to fire the teacher. It was a 5-4 vote about whether we were going to recommend to the state of Virginia that the teacher lose their license. And the reason why, and I was on the 5, I wanted to have the teacher lose the license. But I am not sure that decision was the best thing for the kids in Alexandria City Public Schools. And I'm not sure it was the best thing for the kids in Alexandria City Public Schools because firing the teacher got this person out of Alexandria City Public Schools. In the negotiation with the teacher, this teacher said, I will contest it. I will leave if you fire me. If you choose to try and take my license away, I'm going to contest it. And it was going to cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. So it was going to hurt the Alexandria City finances. I'm glad that we made the decision that we did, but it was not as easy as a decision as it might seem at first blush. All right. I think that there's a lot of evidence that compensation does affect what people decide to do. So teachers, like other walks of life, people respond to labor market incentives. We know this from lots of high quality studies where there's experiments with deviations from the single salary schedule. One of the experiments that I think is terrific is I don't know if you all know Barbara, but is Barbara's work in Wisconsin. And, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, Barbara, but my read is that when pay was made more flexible, that teacher quality on average got better, and it got better because of a combination of in the incentive, like change in productivity of the people who were there effect, and the composition of the people that stayed in the teacher workforce. So it was a combination of both of those things. We also know that simple pay for performance systems don't seem to work all that well. So if you do things like, say, I'm going to give you a bonus of X thousands of dollars if your pay is high, if your students get a higher test score next year, that doesn't look like it has much impact on teacher quality. So you really need a system that's holistic, that ties compensation to good data analysis, to feedback that teachers get, to professional development. And I think the best evidence on that kind of holistic system is from Washington, D.C. So I'm going to leave it at that for now. There's some people taking pictures of the slides. I just want to say, it sounds like I'm about to say, please don't take pictures of the slides. It's not at all what I'm saying. I'm going to say, I'm happy for people to get all of the slides after, so you don't feel like you need to if you don't want to. Yeah. All right. I have no idea what time it is, so somebody... I've got 7 minutes? Oh, my God. All right. All right. I'll just say very, very quickly that I think there are some missed opportunities in terms of hiring, that there are things that we can do to learn more about applicants. This is the focus of some of my work. And actually, contrary to a lot of what you read in the newspapers, when a slot opens up in a school system, there are often a number of people that are applying to work in the schools, particularly at the elementary ed level, right? It varies depending on what kind of subject we're talking about. And as I said to you earlier, it varies depending on the kind of school. But I think there are opportunities to get better on that. Let me, licensure. Lots of studies on teacher licensure tests and how predictive are the licensure tests, and they are all over the map. So there are some licensure tests that aren't predictive of what a teacher ends up doing in the classroom. And then there are some licensure tests that are highly predictive. So and I saw this in one study that I did of connecting licensure test, teacher licensure test performance to student outcomes in Washington. Some of the licensure tests, it was a null. There was zero relationship that I could see between performance and student achievement. But it turned out that if you have somebody who takes the biology test and then is teaching biology, well, hey, it matters. It's better to know more biology. So I think that there's a lot that could be done with that finding. Sometimes people say, let's just get rid of these tests. That's not my position. I think we need to kind of figure out how to make the tests better and more predictive of what we ultimately care about. Last thing I'm going to say. most teachers have to do student teaching. And it turns out that despite the sort of flowery rhetoric that you see in agreements between teacher preparation programs and school systems, I don't think in a lot of cases there's a lot of thought that goes into the match between the mentor teacher and the student teacher. So the setup here is years of experience, just like we talked about before, is on the horizontal axis. Value added is on the vertical axis. And the difference between the red and the blue lines is if you have a very effective teacher, if you have someone who's an average mentor, an average teacher serving as a mentor, versus a very ineffective teacher serving as a mentor. So the lines slope upward, that's the return to teacher experience. If you have a very effective teacher serve as the mentor, rather than an average mentor, you as a novice look like a teacher with 2 years of teaching experience. And what I like about this is it gives us a way of putting a dollar value on mentorship, because we know with salary schedules how much people typically get paid when they have 2 years of experience. And the difference in Washington was something like $2,500. Mentor teachers sometimes get zero. Sometimes they get $500 to serve in that capacity. So I think we underinvest in thinking about pre-service preparation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating about that is that this is oftentimes one semester that occurred.
Yep.
And the cumulative effect, if you're looking at sort of areas above the curve, right, that compounds and just grows. And so the one time, the 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks of an excellent or highly effective mentor that you get for the next however many years really ends up having that much more.
Yep. Yep. And I also think it's not rocket science, right? Like if you like Kerwin and I were lucky enough to learn from someone who is a fantastic mentor. And there's like all kinds of tricks of the trade that I think we probably picked up, some of which we could articulate, some of which we probably couldn't even articulate. So it's not rocket science that you're learning, when you're from the person who is your mentor. Yeah. I think out of time. Yeah. I'm sorry. I knew I had more slides than I could get through, but it has been. Do we have time for like one or two questions or no? No. All right. I will look forward to talking with some of you over the next day or two, and thank you for your time today. What? Okay. Okay. All right. So in DC, the way that the system